unseen angels sent from somewhere to my soul.
I do remember that my father first started publishing the Tidings. This was in 1947, but every week on Friday, right after breakfast, he'd be on the telephone. He'd have a little list of things that he wanted to check out, and he'd call the people involved and make sure that he got all the news accurate and up to date. And he'd sit then in his study upstairs and write the tidings for that week. He didn't really have a desk. He had a base from an old Singer sewing machine with some boards nailed together on top and covered with black oilcloth. By a little after lunch, the draft of the tidings would all be ready, and they had an old L.C. Smith typewriter that my mother would use to type up the stencil, put the ribbon underneath the typewriter and type the stencil. And about the time we'd get home from school, if it was during the school year, my dad would be ready to run off the copies of the tidings on the mimeograph, and my sister or I would put the slip sheets in so that there wouldn't be ink all over the backs of the copies. And after supper, we'd start folding. There were about 400 copies in those years. That's probably not so very different from now, except we don't have to fold them all by hand anymore. But we'd have them folded by the time we went to bed. Of course, in the later years, there was also choir practice on Friday evening. But Saturday morning, right after breakfast, my dad would set the addressograph on the dining room table, and my mother or I would feed the individual copies into that machine, and my dad would usually turn the crank and put the addresses on. There were a few for the soldiers and missionaries to go overseas. It had to be in envelopes, and he'd get it all together and bring the tidings to the post office just before the postmaster, Mac Magnuson, would close the window at 11 o'clock on Saturday, and the tidings would get delivered here on the island on Saturday afternoon. The rest of them would go out to wherever they were being sent on Monday morning.
Memories, how they linger, how they